Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving headfirst into a pretty big topic, a critical look at religion.
Yeah, a big one. We're using excerpts from Friedrich Nietzsche's Human, All Too Human, as our guide.
Exactly. Think of it as us tackling some really fundamental questions, about belief, morality, where that comes from, and maybe why we humans always seem to be searching for meaning.
And Nietzsche, well, he certainly didn't shy away from those big questions, did he?
Not at all. He's known for being provocative, challenging. Today we're really zeroing in on his early critiques of religious belief. Where did he think it all started?
Right, the origins and the nature of belief itself, according to his early work.
Yeah, look, we know religion can be a sensitive topic. It touches on really personal views.
Absolutely.
So we want to be super clear. Our goal here isn't to, take sides or say one view is right or wrong.
No, not at all. It's about understanding Nietzsche's perspective.
Exactly. We want to unpack his arguments, see what insights they might offer, maybe about the human condition generally, why we believe what we believe.
Precisely.
Okay, let's get right into it then. Nietzsche kicks things off by looking at where religious cults came from. That's section 111. And he basically argues that early religious life emerged because people just didn't understand natural laws. They didn't get causality, what makes things happen.
So the key insight there is kind of striking, isn't it? That what we think of as basic scientific reasoning, that's actually pretty new in human history.
Right. It wasn't that early beliefs were inherently irrational.
No, they were logical.
Yeah.
Just based on a completely different understanding of how the world worked. The idea of natural causality as we know it just, wasn't there yet.
Things like weather, getting sick, even luck.
Yeah, none of that was seen as following predictable patterns. It could just happen or not happen for seemingly no reason.
And Nietzsche gives some really vivid examples to show this lack of understanding, right? Like rowing a boat.
Oh yeah, the rowing example. He says they didn't think it was their physical effort making the boat move.
No, it was like a magical ceremony. They were trying to convince a spirit to push the boat, looking for a conscious will behind everything.
It's fascinating, his take on how they interpreted things. Illness, death not natural, they were caused by magical influences.
The whole idea of something happening naturally was basically absent until much later, wasn't it? He mentions the Greeks starting to think about fate.
Right, fate is something even the gods had to obey. That was a shift. But before that, if you used a bow and arrow, success wasn't just skill.
No, there was still this element of some unpredictable force involved.
And if you're well dried up.
Demons, subterranean demons, obviously, not, a dropping water table.
Or sudden death. That had to be an invisible arrow from a god.
He really drives this point home with the mention of Indian customs, too, doesn't he? Offering sacrifices to tools.
Exactly, to hammers, weapons,
Yeah.
things we see as inanimate. For Nietzsche, that showed this deep belief in conscious, volitional forces everywhere in nature.
It's such a different picture from how we tend to see the world now, governed by consistent laws. Makes you appreciate Goethe's view, he mentions. Nature is a source of calm because it is reliable.
Precisely. And that contrast is really Nietzsche's point. He's showing how early humans tried to make sense of a world they didn't understand scientifically and how religion provided those first explanations.
It really can give you that aha moment, thinking about how different their worldview must have been and the huge role religion played back then.
Okay, so building on that idea of early explanations, Nietzsche then takes this really interesting detour into dreams.
Ah, yes, the dream section. How does that connect?
Well, he suggests that the way we reason in dreams, like, jumping to conclusions, accepting weird stuff that's actually like a fossil of how humanity reasoned when awake millennia ago.
So, accepting the first plausible explanation that comes along as the absolute truth.
Pretty much. In dreams, we don't really question the bizarre logic, do we?
Not usually, no. It feels real at the time.
Nietzsche argues that for ages, waking humans did something similar. The first idea that popped into their head to explain something unknown, that was it. That was the truth. No need to test it further.
He mentions those travelers' tales about savages, too, as his evidence. Now, obviously, that language is very dated.
Very. But his point, from his 19th century perspective, was about observing cultures he thought hadn't developed the same kind of, let's say, rigorous logic that was dominant in Europe then.
And he tries to explain why this dream thinking was so common and maybe why it still lingers.
Yeah, he says we've been drilled in it, evolutionarily speaking. For vast stretches of history, this imaginative, quick, agreeable explanation was just the norm.
So maybe dreaming feels easy because our waking brains are actually doing the much harder work of logical thinking, something that developed later.
That seems to be his implication. He uses that analogy about closing your eyes, doesn't he?
Right. The brain sees random light patterns, and our reason instantly tries to form them into shapes, into scenes.
Like we're inferring a cause, the shapes, from an effect, the light patterns, even if there's no real cause there.
Just like in a dream. Our mind is constantly making images, pulling from waking life maybe, and then quickly building a cause and effect story, even if it doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Exactly. It happens so fast, he says, we can get confused about what came first, like a magic trick.
So the big takeaway here is what? That rigorous logic, understanding cause and effect clearly, that's actually a relatively late development for us humans.
Seems so. Our brains still have this older, more primitive tendency to jump to conclusions, to use that dreamlike reasoning.
And maybe we still operate in that mode more often than we think, especially when we're dreaming, but perhaps at other times too.
Absolutely. It really makes you ponder the deep, deep roots of how we actually form our beliefs.
Okay, so how does this all tie back into morality and religion? Nietzsche gets into that in section 96. He argues that originally being moral wasn't about abstract right and wrong.
No, not at all. It simply meant following the established customs. The traditions of your tribe or society, whether they seemed rational or not, was irrelevant.
So good initially just describes someone who naturally, maybe even instinctively, followed those customs.
Pretty much, yeah. Almost like it was inherited. He uses the example of revenge in ancient Greece.
Right. Taking revenge was the custom, so doing it made you good in that specific context.
But he does note a shift over time. Qualities like benevolence, helpfulness, they started becoming more associated with good.
Why? Because they were seen as useful for the community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Useful to the community as a whole. It sort of hints at later ideas about social utility, though Nietzsche's focus is more historical, how the meaning changed.
And evil then was just going against the grain.
Simply not acting according to custom. Resisting tradition, even if the tradition was, completely irrational or maybe even harmful.
So early morality wasn't about this internal struggle of egoism versus altruism or some divine commandment.
Not primarily, according to Nietzsche here.
Yeah.
It was about adherence. Stick to the rules of the group. That was the core thing.
It's really interesting that he puts so much weight on tradition itself.
Yeah, and he explains how these traditions got enforced. He talks about superstitious practices.
Based on misinterpreting random events?
Right. Something happens by chance, people invent a rule around it, and then there's this fear. Fear that the gods will punish the whole community if anyone breaks the rule.
So that fear becomes a powerful enforcement mechanism.
Hugely powerful.
Yeah.
And the older the tradition, the more sacred it became, especially once the original, maybe accidental reason for it was long forgotten.
Just the sheer age gave it authority.
Exactly. It really challenges that notion of morality being some fixed, divinely given thing. Nietzsche's painting it as a social construct, deeply tied to history, with religion playing a key role in locking those customs in place through fear.
It definitely makes you look at our own moral compass and wonder how much is custom, how much is reason.
How much is just what we've always done.
Now, Nietzsche also gets into some more specific, maybe psychological aspects. He talks about Christian hypochondria in section 47. That sounds intense.
It does sound unusual. Think of it less as a physical illness and more as a psychological state. He's suggesting that intense empathy, especially when constantly focused on suffering like the suffering of Christ, could lead to a kind of mental distress.
Like an over-identification.
Yeah, almost like you're mentally echoing that suffering yourself. He saw this particularly in deeply religious people who constantly contemplated the crucifixion, the pain, the sacrifice.
So it's about the potential psychological weight of dwelling on those narratives.
Exactly. How constantly engaging with themes of suffering might actually affect someone's mental well-being. It's a comment on the psychological impact of certain religious focuses.
He also discusses what he calls the artifice of religious interpretation. That's section 126. What's the artifice he's talking about?
Essentially, he's arguing that we often take perfectly normal human experiences, strong emotions, maybe even physical sensations, and we put a religious label on them.
When there might be other ways to understand them.
Right. Think about the experiences described by saints or mystics. Visions, terror, ecstasy, exhaustion. Nietzsche suggests these are often familiar human conditions, sometimes even pathological states, just interpreted through a religious filter.
He brings up Socrates and his demon, that inner voice.
Yeah, he speculates maybe it was just an ear infection, but Socrates, being very moralistic, interpreted it as a divine guide.
That's quite a deflationary take.
It is. And he extends it to prophets, oracles. Their apparent madness or ecstatic utterances could perhaps be understood similarly as misinterpretations of psychological or even neurological states.
So the core idea is that the interpretation depends heavily on the cultural framework.
Absolutely. The same experience could be seen as divine inspiration in one context, or maybe a symptom of illness in another. It really highlights subjectivity and the power of interpretive frameworks, especially within religion. Makes you think about multiple perspectives.
Let's shift to his critique of how religion sometimes labels natural human things as sinful. The section on Christian moral demands sounds pretty pointed.
It is quite critical, yes. Nietzsche argues that certain religions, and also some philosophical traditions, tend to classify natural human drives. He often focuses on eroticism, sexuality, as inherently bad, sinful.
And what's the result of that, according to him?
He believed it leads to a kind of suppression. It oppresses the imagination, fosters gloominess, self-doubt, this constant feeling of having a tormented conscience.
And he thinks this suffering is unnecessary.
Completely. He calls it groundless, just a consequence of holding these particular opinions, these religious beliefs about nature being bad.
He sees it as a kind of manipulation almost.
Yeah, he uses the term artifice again, a trick to make humans suspicious of their own nature, to make them feel bad about themselves.
Why? To create a need for salvation.
Exactly. Create a need for supernatural redemption from sins that, in Nietzsche's view, are largely imaginary because they relate to natural impulses.
He even suggests that Christian moral demands are often deliberately exaggerated, made impossible to actually fulfill.
Right. He wonders if the goal isn't really moral improvement, but rather making people feel as sinful as possible. And then he poses this really provocative question. Is there actually some kind of pleasure found in that feeling of sinfulness?
That's quite a thought.
It is. And he contrasts this sharply with the ancient world, where he saw cultures putting great effort into festivals and cults designed to augment joy, to celebrate life.
Whereas he sees Christianity as often focused on inducing guilt, which paradoxically might intensify religious feeling for some.
It's a challenging psychological insight he's offering there about potential hidden motivations behind certain beliefs and practices.
Okay. Moving towards the end of our selections, Nietzsche makes a pretty sharp observation about the everyday Christian in section 116.
Ah, yes. This follows logically from the previous point, really. He argues, if you truly believe the core Christian dogmas, a vengeful God, universal sinfulness, election, damnation.
The really heavy stuff.
If you accepted that as literal fact, wouldn't the only logical thing be to dedicate your entire existence to salvation? Become a hermit, a priest, live a life of extreme devotion?
That seemed to follow, yes.
But he observes the average everyday Christian doesn't live like that. They pursue worldly goals, enjoy pleasures. They don't seem constantly terrified of hellfire.
So he sees this as an inconsistency.
A massive inconsistency. For Nietzsche, it suggests either a lack of real, deep conviction or maybe a kind of subconscious disbelief in the dogmas themselves.
If the beliefs were held as absolute truth, then the person living a normal life would seem.
Well, he uses strong words like miserable or spiritually imbecilic. Yes, it's harsh language, but his point is about the logical disconnect. It prompts you, the listener, to consider those practical inconsistencies. We often see how people square their stated beliefs with their actual daily lives.
It makes you wonder, yeah, how many beliefs do any of us hold, religious or not, that we don't fully act upon?
It's a very common human thing, isn't it? That gap between belief and action.
Finally, let's touch on Nietzsche's thoughts about the decline of religious feeling and how that might impact the state. This is section 442, and it feels surprisingly relevant today.
It really does. He predicts that as people stop venerating the state in a religious way, seeing it as this sacred, almost divinely sanctioned institution.
That kind of reverence fades.
Exactly. As that fades, so will the general piety and obedience towards it. People will start seeing the state much more pragmatically.
Just in terms of what's in it for me. How does it help me or harm me?
Precisely. And he predicts this will lead to more intense competition for influence. Different groups, individuals, all scrambling for power and advantage within the state system.
And a consequence of that constant struggle for power.
He foresees instability. Rapid changes in who's in charge, making long-term government projects really difficult because there's no continuity.
He takes it even further, suggesting an eventual widespread distrust of all government.
Yeah, and maybe even a novel resolve, as he puts it, to just get rid of the concept of the state altogether,
Yeah.
to blur the lines between private and public life.
Wow. And he even envisions private companies taking over state functions, like security.
He does. It's quite prophetic in some ways. He basically concludes that this weakening of the state, this liberation of the private person, is actually a downstream consequence of the democratic ideal itself.
It really makes you think about the connections between broad societal beliefs, our institutions, and how individuals relate to them, the long-term ripple effects of losing those traditional anchors of authority.
Definitely.
Well, this has been quite the journey, a really fascinating deep dive into Nietzsche's critique of religion.
It really has. We've covered his ideas on the origins, psychological, social, historical roots of belief and practice.
And it's so clear his work is designed to provoke thought, right? To
Yeah.
make us really examine the assumptions we might hold about religion, about morality.
Absolutely. He wants us to look deeper, beyond the surface, to question the why behind beliefs.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, to chew on is this. How might Nietzsche's ideas prompt you to examine the underlying reasons for your own beliefs or the beliefs of people around you?
Yeah, how much influence does tradition have, or our own psychological makeup, or the way society is structured?
Definitely food for thought.
And hey, if this has piqued your interest, there's obviously a lot more Nietzsche to explore, or other philosophers who wrestle with these huge questions of belief and meaning.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.